Good evening. It's December 19th, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I would like to welcome you to our weekly broadcast from the LaRouche PAC website of our webcast, which we broadcast every Friday night at 8 p.m. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Jeffrey Steinberg from Executive Intelligence Review, as well as Benjamin Deniston from the LaRouche PAC Scientific Research Team. The three of us had a meeting yesterday evening with Lyndon LaRouche and have spoken with him over the last 24 hours. So the presentation you hear tonight will reflect Mr. LaRouche's outlook on the current world situation. Now, I'd like to begin tonight's broadcast by announcing that the Schiller Institute has issued a press release this week announcing the first batch of prominent individuals who have signed the petition titled "The U.S. and Europe Must Reject Geopolitics and Collaborate with the BRICS." The press release, which was issued this past Wednesday, December 17th, reads as follows. A grouping of more than 100 prominent politicians, businessmen, academics, scientists, and artists from 20 countries have publicly endorsed a resolution calling on the United States and Europe to collaborate with the BRICS nations in the interest of peace and economic development. The resolution, sponsored by the Schiller Institute, was issued in response to the offer of China's President Xi Jinping for the United States to join China's New Silk Road and abandon the policies of confrontation with particularly Russia and China. The prominent signers are joined by more than 1,000 ordinary citizens from these and other nations who urgently want their governments to abandon the policies of confrontation and collaborate with the BRICS countries based on the Treaty of Westphalia's principle of the benefit of the other. The Schiller Institute intends to continue to garner support for the resolution from intellectual leaders and ordinary citizens alike to create a mass movement for economic development and peace. Helga Sepp-LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute, said, "The idea of collaboration with Xi Jinping's offer to cooperate with the New Silk Road is the most important peace initiative to get the world away from the edge of confrontation and war. Collaboration on this initiative is a fantastic perspective for mankind. I am calling on all people to distribute this resolution and help us get more support for it." Now, among the signers from the United States are included numerous very prominent individuals, including Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the United States, former Congressman Cornelius Gallagher, who served from 1959 to 1973, representing the state of New Jersey, Dr. Edward Lozansky, who's the president and the founder of the American University in Moscow, as well as being the head of the World Russia Forum, Nomi Prince, who's the author of a recently released book, All the President's Bankers, Dr. Fred Dalmar, professor of political theory at the University of Notre Dame and co-chair of the World Public Forum, as well as numerous other labor, business, academic, political, diplomatic, community, and cultural leaders from all around the United States who are far too numerous to list here. And then internationally, there are very prominent individuals who signed from Ukraine, Russia, France, Sweden, Spain, Slovakia, Austria, Paraguay, Guinea, Nicaragua, Mexico, Malaysia, Italy, India, Holland, Greece, Denmark, Colombia, Chile, the Barbados, and from Argentina. So you can see that this is representative of the entire world. Now, in addition to these these 140 or so VIPs, there is over 1,000 other ordinary citizens who have also added their names to this petition, all of whom recognize the urgency of the United States to radically change its policy at this moment and join this emerging new international order. So, as the press release mentioned, the idea was to first publish this batch of signatures and then use this to catalyze another round of outreach, which we ask all of you who are watching this broadcast to help participate in actively pursuing. And you'll see at the bottom of your screen a link for the full petition, where you can access the text of the petition as well as the list of signatures and then the electronic signature form that can be accessed on the LaRouchePAC website. And we ask you, if you haven't signed yet, to immediately sign this and to immediately activate yourself to circulate this to every prominent individual that you can come into contact with. Now, this resolution has already gained significant resonance in the past 48 hours worldwide, especially from inside China, where numerous media publications published the press release in full and linked to this list of signatures, including People's Daily, Xinhua, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences website, the website of China Youth International, several local Chinese city papers, as well as several Chinese language websites from across Europe. Additionally, the website of the World Public Forum also posted the press release yesterday. Now, it's not surprising that there would be such an immediate resonance of this petition from within the BRICS countries, especially from China. Remember, it was President Xi Jinping who originally made the offer to the United States to join the BRICS during the APEC conference a month ago. These countries, both China as well as Russia, know very well that unless the United States is forced to radically change its policy, the world could find itself in a state of thermonuclear conflict in the very immediate future. And so any voices of sanity that are coming from within the United States have a very significant impact on these countries. Now, to set up my first question, let me just situate this in the context of some of the very significant developments from this week, specifically the annual press conference that President Vladimir Putin delivered in Moscow yesterday. There's reports on this press conference that are on the LaRouchePAC website today, and in this press conference, as well as in the days leading up to it, both President Putin and close advisors, including Foreign Minister Lavrov and others, made it very clear that they see that the policy towards Russia has now become an open policy, explicitly, of regime change, targeting Putin directly, and that this is nothing less than a policy of war. Now, what President Putin responded to during this webcast that he delivered yesterday was the fact that this has been the open policy, which is now becoming much more clear. What President Putin referred back to was the policy which was implemented immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall to encircle Russia, NATO to expand to Russia's borders, to build what he called new walls, including the virtual wall of the ballistic missile defense systems right on Russia's border, and explicitly to support and finance terrorism on Russia's border and within Russia's territory in order to try to destabilize the country. Here's one quote from Putin's webcast. He said, "After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia opened itself up to our partners. What did we see? A direct and fully fledged support of terrorism in the North Caucasus. They directly supported terrorism. Do you understand? Is that what partners usually do? This is an established fact, and everybody knows it." So I think that gives you a taste of the tone that President Putin was taking. What he also explicitly made clear is that he understands that there is, in his words, a fifth column, quote unquote, that is operating against the interests of Russia on behalf of foreign powers, but operating from behind Russia's borders. Now, what I want to pose to you, Jeff, as our first question is, earlier this week, Lyndon LaRouche put out a very precise statement of policy that Russia must adopt in the face of this wartime operation, which was addressed directly to the Russian leadership in terms of economic policies that must be implemented. So could you please present what these measures were to our viewers, as well as giving us a general sense of the situation this week regarding this all-out offensive against Russia?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I think it's important to consider both what President Putin did do as well as what he did not do at his press conference yesterday. He was clearly aware of the fact that Russia is in already a state of active warfare. Back in April of this year, during the Moscow International Security Conference, President Putin himself, Defense Minister Shoigu, the Chief of Staff of the Russian General Staff, and other officials both from Russia and from Belarus presented a coherent, almost day-long presentation that the new form of warfare, the new form of asymmetric warfare being directed against Russia is color revolution, regime change, and that the kinds of actions that were carried out in the Maidan Square in Ukraine, beginning in November of 2013, carrying through February of 2014 and beyond, represented a new form of warfare, and that basically the use of snipers, particularly from neo-Nazi organizations, the remnants and offshoots of the Banderist movement that was part of the Nazi assault on the Soviet Union during World War II, were openly used, and that the policy of sanctions and economic warfare, combined with the training and financing of these fifth columns of so-called democracy, regime change, and human rights activists, was understood by Moscow and by Minsk as an actual form of warfare in which the traditional rules of war are violated, because this is a case in which very often legitimate protesters among the population are used as a human shield for terrorists operating to carry out regime change. So this is a policy that has been clearly developed and stated by Russia, by Belarus, for quite a number of months. One of the participants in that April conference in Moscow was a prominent Washington, D.C. military analyst, Dr. Anthony Cordesman. He came back to Washington clearly shaken up by what he had heard and prepared a 50-plus page report complete with PowerPoints of some of the presentations. And his basic message was, this is a change in thinking in Russia, and if this is misunderstood or ignored in Washington and in Europe, then this will be a dangerous and fatal mistake. So President Putin laid out very clearly not only that the current actions, the sanctions against Russia, have nothing to do with Crimea, have nothing to do with the events of the past year, but are part of a long-running strategy of regime change to remove the Putin government, to break up Russia. He cited the fact that there are some people who even question Russia's right to maintain control over Siberia, which is, of course, historically preposterous. So this was the environment that President Putin stepped into and addressed a group of 1,200 or more Russian and foreign journalists for a period of more than 3 hours. Now, 2 days before that, Lyndon LaRouche made the point that Russia was under combined assault between the sanctions policy, between the fact that Saudi Arabia, on behalf of the West, is conducting oil warfare against Russia, against Iran, against a number of other countries. Basically, Saudi Arabia has reduced the price of oil to significantly below cost break-even for most oil-producing areas around the world. At the beginning of this week, you could buy a barrel of crude oil on the European spot market for $48 a barrel. Less than a year ago, it was $114. And of course, Russia, as a major exporter of oil and gas, is a primary target. So you have sanctions, which were of minimal significance to Russia, but now combined with this massive assault through an artificial driving down of the price of oil, has created conditions where economic warfare is being practiced. Now, under those conditions, and under similar conditions that prevailed in Asia during the late 1990s, where some of the same cast of hedge fund and derivatives traders from the West, led at that time by George Soros, were conducting currency warfare against Asian countries, particularly Malaysia. At that time, the head of the Malaysian government, Mahathir Mohamad, imposed capital and exchange controls and shut off the possibility of speculators moving in, buying into the currency, buying into the stock market, and then pulling out abruptly to create absolute economic chaos, collapse of currency values, and major social crises. So the measures that were taken by Mahathir Mohamad in 1998, the Malaysian method, is a universal principle that if you want to prevent speculative runs on your currency, whether it's coming from foreign sources or whether it's coming from internal fifth column elements, then you simply impose capital and exchange controls. This means simply that the free flow of cash from one currency into another across borders is curtailed and limited. Obviously, with world trade being a critical part of the international economy, there are certain transactions that are legitimate trade transactions that can and must be converted freely between currencies. This is not an issue that is widely understood in the United States because since the time of the very beginning of the Bretton Woods system in 1944, the dollar was established as the world reserve currency. So the dollar, in a sense, as a world reserve currency, is insulated against the kinds of speculative assaults that we're now seeing against the Russian ruble. We're seeing similar attacks against the currencies of Brazil, Turkey, Argentina. So a government has every right in the world to impose regulatory limits. You can do it through absolute restrictions on the volume of currency trade on a given day or week or month. You can impose very stiff tariffs and other penalties on people engaging in this kind of activity. But it is a natural and perfectly legitimate phenomenon for a sovereign government to take these protective measures. Now, as I said, I want to discuss both what President Putin did do and also what he didn't do at his press conference on Thursday. He did not, unfortunately, announce capital and exchange controls, and at least indicated for the moment that he will continue with the present policies of artificially raising interest rates as an incentive to keep currency investments denominated in rubles, that he would put certain pressure on certain major Russian companies, including those that have large state sector participation, to minimize their own engagement in currency speculation. And so he did not yet take the plunge. But what I would take note of very carefully is that today, Belarus, which is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union with Russia, did announce capital and exchange controls. So this is a very new breaking development just in the last several hours. But we cannot rule out the possibility that this is a trial balloon, potentially even a signal of actions that are being considered by Russia. But President Putin was extremely circumspect and cautious against taking any measures that could form a justification for an escalation against Russia, given the fact that there is already a state of active warfare. So Mr. LaRouche's statement calling for capital and exchange controls and for a shift towards using Russia's rather extensive $416 billion in hard currency reserves as a capital pool for a Hamiltonian banking system directed at investment in critical projects for infrastructure, social welfare, and the likes. So these ideas are on the table. Sergei Glaziev, a leading Russian economist and advisor to President Putin, has joined very much with Mr. LaRouche in calling for the imposition of capital and exchange controls, and has criticized the decision not to yet take these urgent defensive measures. I think in the coming days and coming weeks, because of the dangerous financial collapse moving forward in the transatlantic region, Western Europe and the United States, particularly Wall Street, it's very obvious that the financial onslaught, the targeting of Russia, the regime change campaign will continue unabated. So this is a question that we will be clearly revisiting in the days and weeks ahead. President Putin did not take the critical measures yet, but clearly the door is open if the West chooses to go forward with further war provocations.
Now, in the context of what Jeff went through just now, I would also like to raise the topic which we presented preliminarily in last week's webcast, which is the immediate necessity of destroying the candidacy of Jeb Bush, who earlier this week announced the formation of an exploratory committee for his presidential campaign. And I think this is directly relevant to what we have referenced here from President Putin, where he identified the so-called fifth column attempting to destroy Russia from the inside, as well as the use of avowed Nazis in Ukraine to wage war from without. And as we presented here last week, what Jeb Bush and the entire Bush family represents is the original fifth column here in the United States, quite literally. Prescott Bush was among those who, on Wall Street, were not only financing the rise of Hitler and Mussolini in Europe, to be deployed, incidentally, to wage war against Russia then, but also sponsoring the rise of fascist movements here in the United States that were attempting to use these movements to commit a regime change against Franklin Roosevelt, as in the famous case of the coup that Smedley Butler revealed. This coincided, of course, with the attempted assassination of Roosevelt, which occurred immediately after his election and prior to his swearing in as president. Now, Roosevelt identified this fascist fifth column operating inside the United States and shut down Prescott Bush's operation and seized his assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act, which was part of his general declaration of war against Wall Street, which also included Glass-Steagall. However, the Bush legacy has persisted after Roosevelt's death through two Bush presidencies, and it's now come back to haunt us again in the form of Prescott's grandson, Jeb. So, Jeff, I know that you've been personally involved in waging war against the Bush Leaguers for quite a while, and I know our viewers would appreciate some remarks from you on how to ensure that a Bush is never allowed anywhere near the White House ever again.
Well, first of all, I think that Jeb Bush sticking his head up by announcing the formation of an exploratory committee probably could not have come at a worse time from the standpoint of the Bush family. The fact of the matter is that Senator Dianne Feinstein towards the closing moments of this last session of the current U.S. Congress, released the unclassified version of the Senate Intelligence Committee report on the torture program, the renditions and extraordinary interrogation techniques program that was carried out during the George W. Bush, Dick Cheney presidency. And even though many of the elements of that program, the kidnappings, the waterboarding, all of these things were generally out there, the fact that you had a Senate intelligence report, a 500-page précis of a more than 6,000-page investigative document, revived some of the vivid memories of the horrors of the Bush-Cheney presidency. I think that probably for some people out there, the horrors of the Obama presidency have prompted people to forget just how devastating the Bush-Cheney presidency was. And so suddenly people are confronted with the glaring evidence of waterboarding, of other forms, literally, of torture. And true to their nature, the Bush apparatus, Vice President Dick Cheney, the former CIA director at the time that some of these things were happening, General Michael Hayden, Alberto Gonzales, who was the White House General Counsel and then Attorney General under Bush, all came forward over the past 2 weeks aggressively defending these indefensible criminal actions, these Nuremberg crimes that were carried out by elements of the intelligence community. As we found out, as more details have come out on this, many people in the intelligence community refused to participate. They knew that it was wrong, and they also knew that it was destined ultimately to blow up. And so much of the activity was carried out by contractors, a program that was pioneered by Bush's Vice President Dick Cheney. So you have suddenly a vivid reminder to the American people, even among those people who don't know, Matt, what you just pointed out about the really nasty history of Prescott Bush, the fact that Prescott Bush and his business partner Averell Harriman in 1933 put up the money to bail out the Nazi Party after it had been decimated in German elections, and Hitler was on the verge of suicide, and suddenly a massive cash infusion came in to give the Nazis a second wind. Prescott Bush was responsible for that, and that is not just his own personal legacy, but is a characteristic of the Bush family and the Bush dynasty. So the fact that we had Dianne Feinstein courageously coming out and saying, look, I know the Islamic State is posing terrorist threats to the United States. I had to do a lot of soul searching to decide whether or not it was appropriate to release this report at this time when there are so many dangers out there. And she said, ultimately, I realized that the soul of our nation is at stake, that if we can come up with any pretext for allowing torture and other clear violations of international law to go unpunished, then we as a nation are bankrupt and morally doomed. And therefore, she said, I have confidence that this country has those qualities of goodness to be able to reach in and actually take in the horrors of what was done in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 through this torture interrogations program, and that we can actually put it behind us by clearly airing what we did. And part of that process is that the people involved should be punished. So the Bush family is the torture policy. They are the poster children of this kind of abomination. And as the result of that, I think that, ironically, the release of that report will be a devastating blow, probably a killer blow to Jeb Bush's prospects of running for president. And of course, this week we also had the announcement that the Vatican had successfully mediated an agreement, basically a prisoner exchange between the United States and Cuba, that opens the door for a normalization of relations after half a century. And again, the Jeb Bush circles in Florida. Remember, he was a two-term governor of Florida, and one core of his constituency down there were the Bay of Pigs, real hardcore Cuban community, anti-communists, kill Castro, destroy Cuba, and they predictably also went ballistic, while in fact many younger generation Cuban Americans are applauding the fact that perhaps there's now an opportunity for normalization. These things are going to be a particular immediate scar on the Bush family name, and well-deserved. But I think it's important to realize that there are plenty of people who are going to talk about elements of why Jeb Bush would be a disaster were he to even be allowed to run for president. But I think the more important thing to bear in mind is you are looking at a family oligarchy that now spans 3 generations and others coming up in the future through the ranks. So there's a characteristic of this family that was embedded in the activities of Prescott Bush. Of course, George Herbert Walker Bush was instrumental in the violations of the law, in the railroading of Lyndon LaRouche and scores of colleagues into jail, simply because LaRouche was the architect of policies that were greatly beneficial to the United States, such as the Strategic Defense Initiative. So another element of the Bush family legacy is what former Attorney General Ramsey Clark called the worst violations of U.S. constitutional law that he had ever experienced in the framing up of LaRouche and Company. So that's Bush family morality. And the Bush family attempting now to put themselves once again forward as a viable candidacy for the Republican presidency in 2016 is something that no sane American can tolerate. And just one final point to make, which is that the announcement by Jeb comes in a very specific context, the context that we've spoken about earlier, namely that the United States under Obama, other NATO countries, particularly the British, are in a flight forward provocation against Russia. And during the Bush-Cheney presidency, you had some of the early events that President Putin talked about in his press conference. It was during that period that you had an aggressive support for the kinds of warfare, terrorist warfare against Russia, typified by the 2 Chechen wars. So Cheney, Bush, Jeb Bush, who was a founding signator on the PNAC resolution, that's the New American Century Group that formed the core of the Bush-Cheney neocon administration. Jeb Bush was a signator on PNAC. So there are particular crimes, but far more important is the nature of the Bush family as a historic phenomenon in the United States that represents an alien British invasion that is basically the antagonist to anything that the American constitutional tradition genuinely represents. So I think that it's crucial that the Bush candidacy be swept aside as publicly and as dramatically and as quickly as possible, because the implications for this crisis with Russia and other things stand in the balance.
And I would also just add, as was stated by former Senator Bob Graham on an interview with on CNN last week, that the publication of this torture report by Dianne Feinstein's committee also opens the door to the declassification of the 28 pages on 9/11 and the Saudi role in that attack, which, as those who have read these pages have said, will be very embarrassing to the Bush family. And we know that this will be getting a lot of traction at the beginning of the next session of Congress. Now, our next question for the evening is our institutional question, which reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, there are clear indications that North Korea has been involved in cyber attacks against targets in the United States in response to a soon-to-be-released Hollywood movie depicting the assassination of Kim Jong-un. These have included threats of terrorist attacks on movie theaters showing the film, and the leaking of internal Sony Films emails and communications with State Department officials from the Obama administration involved in North Korea policy. How should the U.S. respond, in your view, to this kind of cyber warfare?
Well, I think we have a slight update from the point that the question was asked, because it now would appear that this is no longer a soon-to-be-released film, and that the film has been actually probably postponed indefinitely and maybe permanently. Look, there are many quote-unquote issues that come up that fill the media constantly. Issues related to this instance. There's a dozen other stories that are grabbing headlines in all of the major news networks today, but they don't really address the nature of where things stand in the world. So rather than taking up issue by issue by issue, the pertinent question is what's really going on here? Now, just even to take up this question of the interview, this Sony Columbia Pictures incident, this is not unrelated to the war danger that we've been talking about. Among some of those internal Sony emails and documents that were made public by the hackers in this case, some of the information that came out is that this was a project of the Obama administration. Leading Obama administration officials, including the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia-Pacific Affairs, Daniel Roussel, were consulted on the movie. They had advanced screening. They were asked whether or not the concluding scene of the movie, in which the head of state of North Korea, apparently someone modeled on the actual current head of state, Kim Jong-un, is assassinated by having his head blown up in one of these gory Hollywood scenes, whether or not that was appropriate or not. The administration's special human rights ombudsman for North Korea, I believe his name is Robert King, was a consultant on the movie. A RAND Corporation advisor to the Obama National Security Council was a consultant on the movie. So let's step back a second in the context of what we've been discussing: war against Russia, war against China. Is this really a Hollywood movie, or is this a propaganda piece that was directed at blowing up what we know is a very dangerous and very fragile situation in North Asia? It's not very difficult to stage a provocation against the North Korean government. So you have to ask yourself, why would senior officials of this administration be participating in something like this, knowing full well that you're playing with fire? North Korea clearly has developed a capability for the deployment of nuclear weapons. I personally don't know how advanced the delivery system capability is, but certainly this is a situation that leaves a lot of diplomats and military planners here in China and elsewhere with a lot of sleepless nights. So why in anybody's right mind would you be doing something like this? We're in a digital era where cyber warfare and these kinds of things are going to be naturally coming up because we have an expanded arsenal of irregular and asymmetric warfare that's playing out. The sanctions warfare, the oil warfare, the regime change warfare by Project Democracy and entities like that we've been discussing throughout this broadcast, are all forms of not Cold War, but actual hot war provocations. So all of this is going on, and under these circumstances, sure, there are questions of how do you deal with cyber attacks that have vast commercial implications. The entire film archive and even some as yet unreleased films from Sony Pictures are now out all over the internet. I'm sure as I speak that there are people all over the world that are downloading and grabbing up these things, and Sony's going to lose a couple of $100 million in the process. But the real issue is, why would any administration in its right mind give any credence? Why wouldn't you just simply tell Sony Pictures, don't do this? We're in a dangerous and fragile diplomatic situation in North Asia. So why would you do something as preposterous and provocative as this with full backing from an administration unless they were gunning to create a confrontation in North Asia? So that's the larger framework in which to judge this question.
Now, it's very clear from what we've gone through that the British and Obama have escalated very aggressively against Russia, against China in this past week. But as LaRouche warned yesterday, this is coming from a position of weakness and desperation. And I think this desperation was expressed very clearly last week when both Obama and Jamie Dimon joined forces to go on a full-court press against the U.S. Congress to force through the repeal of this Section 716 of Dodd-Frank, which was the prohibition against federal government bailouts of swaps entities. This provoked a very significant counter-reaction from a certain faction of Democrats on Capitol Hill, centered around Elizabeth Warren, as well as Maxine Waters and others. Senator Warren took to the floor 3 days in a row last week to denounce this attempt to sneak through a government guarantee, essentially, for derivatives swaps dealers, identifying the direct Wall Street control over the White House, which has colluded with top banks such as Citigroup to channel trillions of dollars in dirty money into the pockets of Wall Street in the form of bailouts. In the third of these speeches on December 12th, Senator Warren made an impassioned call for Glass-Steagall, saying enough is enough. Instead of passing laws that create new bailout opportunities for too-big-to-fail banks, let's pass the bipartisan 21st Century Glass-Steagall Act that would help break up these giant banks. And in addition to Warren's speech, you've had a number of other Democrats who have been publicly saying that they see this moment now as a Glass-Steagall moment. So, Jeff, the question I have for you on this is, what must be done to provide the necessary leadership to ensure that this so-called Glass-Steagall moment is acted upon in the first weeks of the new Congress in the beginning of January, not only to force through the immediate measures that are necessary to save the United States from a total economic meltdown, but also to, as Franklin Roosevelt did, declare an all-out war on Wall Street and rally the forces of leadership that exist that are going to be instrumental in creating what LaRouche has been calling for as a new presidency built around the principles of Alexander Hamilton.
Well, first of all, we are headed for a real blowout in the whole transatlantic region. I think it's notable that the timing of this real flight forward intervention by President Obama and Jamie Dimon came at the same time that the Saudi oil war is wreaking havoc in the United States, particularly on Wall Street. President Obama just earlier today and earlier this week was boasting about the fact that the United States is increasingly becoming more and more independent because of this massive expansion of shale oil and gas production. Well, with the Saudis driving the price of oil down way below break-even cost, you're about to see this entire sector of the U.S. economy blow out. There were interviews a few weeks ago with some leading shale oil and gas producers who basically said, well, we're sitting pretty for the time being because we've already forward sold the next several years of deliveries, and we did that before the price collapse happened. Well, who did they sell it to? They sold it to Wall Street. So Wall Street is sitting right now on a ticking time bomb of oil future contracts, precisely the kinds of swaps that were prohibited under this one tiny element of Dodd-Frank that was worth a darn thing. So now that that's been repealed, the door is open for a bailout of Wall Street, particularly those instruments that are now about to blow out. In Europe, consequences of the sanctions against Russia, and now added to the oil warfare and the targeting for destruction of the Russian ruble. How much of Europe, how many European banks have great exposure in the Russian ruble trade and in various other Russian investments? We already had a 1998 Russian debt reorganization and default that almost blew out the entire world economy when just one relatively small hedge fund, long-term capital management, blew up. So we are on the cusp of a complete breakdown of the existing system. And we've now reached a political breakpoint. What Matt just indicated about last week's reaction, it wasn't just Democrats. Progressive Democrats tended to take the lead, but it was an interesting bipartisan reaction because a number of anti-Wall Street Republicans, some of the Tea Party Republicans who were voted into office as anti-Wall Street populists, came together around the same idea. So you've got a political explosion and a potential political realignment. And yes, we're headed for the kind of blowout that will lead inevitably to either a Glass-Steagall moment or a new bailout on a scale vastly bigger than the $21.3 trillion bailout that we saw in 2008, 2009. So the necessary first step, you've got to impose Glass-Steagall. In a certain sense, under the original Franklin Roosevelt Glass-Steagall that must be restored, you had a kind of a two-tiered system. Money that was deposited and insured and protected in commercial banks, whether they were federal or state chartered, was protected. And at the same time, that money was restricted in terms of how it could be invested. It could be invested only in the real economy, in business development, in mortgages, in household loans, and the kinds of activity that actually benefits the nation as a whole. If you wanted to gamble and you wanted to engage in speculative activity, you could put your money in a brokerage house and you could let them gamble away with it, but knowing full well that there was no taxpayer liability to cover your gambling debts if you lost. That's what Glass-Steagall did. In a certain sense, Glass-Steagall itself was a form of internal domestic capital controls. If you were an honest, hardworking citizen and put your money in a commercial bank, you could sleep well at night because you know your money was safe, it was insured by the federal government, and it would go to productive purposes. You had other investments that you could make perhaps with slightly higher yields, with certain kinds of funds that were earmarked for longer-term investment projects and infrastructure and things like that. All of those things reflected the real economy. They reflected the Hamiltonian principle at the core of our entire constitutional republic. For Hamilton, the idea of directed federal credit was aimed at building up the real economy, investing in infrastructure, investing in scientific research and development. That's what the real economy was, and that's what investment through a system of national banking was all about. The idea of the first and second national banks was that you could make decisions based on the areas of the country which were most appropriate to invest money. You didn't simply rely on a localized economy. Under our federal Constitution, the United States is one single union. States and counties are convenient instruments for governing at the local level. But we are one union, and our nation stands or falls on the basis of how the nation, how our economy does as a whole. That's the Hamiltonian idea. By going back to Glass-Steagall, by basically shutting out the gambling casino and going back to protected commercial banks and going back to federal directed credit authorized by the Congress under our federal Constitution, we can begin to turn things around. We can begin to rebuild. We can begin to create meaningful jobs. We can create a future that's worthy. And furthermore, in this highly interdependent world, we can go back to another cornerstone principle of Franklin Roosevelt, which was enshrined in the original Bretton Woods system of 1944. We remove the possibility of gambling and speculating on national sovereign currencies as if they were gambling chips at a casino. You go back to a system of fixed exchange rates. You therefore create favorable conditions for long-term investment in regional projects, major infrastructure projects of the sort that the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS New Development Bank, and these other institutions are promoting. But here in the United States, it's now reached the point where it is an existential issue. Our economy will not survive if we don't succeed in getting Glass-Steagall reinstated as soon as the new Congress comes back in January. And that's where each of you listening to this broadcast tonight have a critical role to play. You've got to understand the issues. You've got to be active. You've got to contact your congressman. We saw in September of 2013, when the issue was put on the table to the American people, do you want to bomb Syria? Every congressional office was inundated with phone calls, emails, letters, constituent visits, and there was an overwhelming 100-to-1 majority that said, don't do it. Now we're saying that same kind of level of mobilization has to be activated on behalf of something positive that will put the United States back in alignment with the BRICS countries and back on a path of economic recovery rather than collapse. And that starts with Glass-Steagall. Lyndon LaRouche has laid out 4 cardinal laws of what must be accomplished, but Glass-Steagall is the initiating and indispensable first step before a return to capital investment through a Hamiltonian national banking system and emphasis on the most advanced scientific and technological work that we're capable of.
Good, thank you. Now, for our final question, I would just like to pursue what Mr. LaRouche has identified as the Hamilton principle a little bit more in depth. And just to return to our initial subject here tonight, which was the publication of this very impressive list of signatories onto the petition calling for the United States to join the BRICS, I think it's necessary to emphasize that this new paradigm, which the BRICS represents, is not just an extension of the current system of government or the current axioms of thought which dominate politics and economics today, or even the scientific and cultural world for that matter. You're talking about an entirely new understanding of what mankind is as a species and what the fundamental principles underlying economics must be. as well as the basic political organization of society in general. This type of political revolution, which is urgently necessary for mankind's survival in the short term, requires and must be premised upon a fundamental scientific and philosophical revolution in the basic outlook of mankind, both his view of himself and in terms of his relationship to the universe more generally. And what the Hamilton principle implies is that money is worthless absent the real productive value, which is defined by the human mind. Measurement of economic value is not something which is measured by money, but by the successive revolutions in man's influence over the solar system. Now, obviously, this is implied in what the U.S. must join BRICS petition calls for, and we must base this new paradigm on a principle of human economy which clearly distinguishes between man and beast, and defines a positive principle of what the human species is and the role that we must play. So to address this a little bit more in depth, I'd like to ask Benjamin Deniston to come to the podium.
Thanks, Matthew. So I would like to just take a couple minutes and underscore Mr. LaRouche's views on this issue. You know, as you said, Matthew, Lynn has emphasized that this is not just, it's a dramatic world situation, but this is not just an opportunity to fix the current world system as it is, but to actually create an entire new stage for mankind. And a new stage that has to be premised on what Mr. LaRouche has called a scientific understanding of the distinction of mankind from the animals, together with what his wife, Helga Zepp LaRouche, has called for as a new paradigm for mankind. And I would say we might even call this the science behind what Chinese President Xi Jinping has called the win-win cooperation policy. So the crucial issue is this scientific understanding of the unique nature of the human species. Or to put it otherwise, the difference between man and animal, as Mr. LaRouche has continued to emphasize the point. Now, animals progress in a certain way. Animal life progresses. By evolution, the systems of animals as a whole will increase its anti-entropy. This is what the great Russian scientist Vernadsky recognized and what he called as his second biogeochemical principle. But this type of advance is, in a sense, an involuntary advance. It's an involuntary turnover of one species to the next, with one species being replaced by a higher order species. So while the whole process of animal life on the history of this planet has moved forward, has been anti-entropic in a certain sense, any one species in that process has been fixed, biologically fixed by the conditions it participates in. But mankind is different. Mankind progresses, but not biologically. Mankind progresses only by the unique powers of creative human thought. Now, this can actually be illustrated relatively easily. If you just compare what you might call the ecological characteristics of any animal species with the ecological characteristics of mankind. Start with something like carrying capacity or maximum potential population. The carrying capacity of any single animal species will be fixed. It'll be an externally defined fixed function. The carrying capacity for the human species, the potential of the human species to have a larger and larger population, is a variable function, not a fixed function. And it's not externally defined, but it's self-defined by mankind's own creative capabilities. So the difference between man and animal is not a quantity, it's not a value, it's a different principle. Any animal species can be defined by a particular value. Mankind cannot be defined by a value. Mankind is defined by the unique ability to change the value willfully of the entire species as a whole. So now what does this mean in practice? Why would we say this is the science behind a win-win BRICS cooperation policy? Well, this means for mankind that wealth is not something that man just finds in places. Value is not something that we just go out and find. Value is something that mankind creates by this type of process. So I want to take one example to illustrate this, which is the current water crisis. I want to highlight this because some NASA scientists just released a new study which focused on California, which shows that California now needs something like 11 trillion gallons of water, or nearly 42 cubic kilometers of water, just to recover from the current drought. Now, to put those very large numbers in some type of perspective, California's allocation of the Colorado River, one of the largest sources of water for California, especially Southern California, is somewhere around 4 to 5 cubic kilometers per year. So, as a thought experiment, we couldn't actually do this because the water is needed for other places, but as a thought experiment, if we were to double California's allocation of the Colorado River, as an example, it would still take over 8 years just to match the current deficit that now exists. And that wouldn't even account for the continual building of a greater deficit over that 8-year period. Just to give you a scale of the crisis now hitting California. But it's not just California, it's the whole southwestern United States is in a major drought. And it's not just the United States. China needs water. Australia needs water. The nations of North Africa, of the Middle East, and of Central Asia all need water. Water is a huge issue for the coming period. But remember that we're talking about water. We're talking about something that covers the majority of the entire Earth's surface. There is no actual lack of water on this planet per se. There's a lack of the application of the type of resource creating, creative human improvement of the system. That's what's lacking. The existing fresh water supplies that we're looking at, they don't exist in finite stores, finite amounts, but you're talking about cycles. You're talking about natural cycles of water moving from the ocean to the land back into the ocean. You're talking about cycles of a process of evaporation, precipitation, and runoff back into the ocean, all of which is ultimately powered by the sun. So that defines the process in which we're working here. So we can't talk about just amounts of water, but we're talking about rates of cycles, or the rates of activity of cycles. Now, to return to the issue here, for animals, the rate of any local or regional cycle, if it's too low, the animals can't do anything. If there's not enough water, then more advanced animal life will just not be able to exist in the region, and the region is left to be taken over by lower forms of life. But obviously, as we know, for mankind, this is different. Mankind can control and change existing cycles. Mankind can take an existing water cycle on the scale of a continent, and mankind can actually increase the productivity of that entire water cycle, can increase the wealth and the value created by that entire water cycle by river management, by river diversion systems. What Franklin Roosevelt did with the Tennessee Valley Authority, what China is now doing with their South Water North program, and what the U.S. should have done with NWAPA decades ago. That's one aspect. But we can go further. Mankind can create new cycles. We can use desalination systems to create our own fresh water, freeing ourselves from relying on solar activity alone to create freshwater supplies. We can begin to develop weather modification technologies to potentially manage and modulate atmospheric moisture flows. So if you look at the potential available to mankind today, you could say it might take a little bit of time. It'll certainly take a lot of work. But there's no intrinsic reason why mankind couldn't address all of the water needs for even a much larger population than we have on the planet today. We can create the needed resources specifically by increasing the energy flux density of mankind's activity per capita and per square kilometer, per area. Especially, what will be critical for this is the development of fission and fusion technologies and economic systems. Now, I think it's worth, so stating that, posing that, I think it's worth just stepping back and reflecting on the implications of what we're talking about. You know, obviously no animal could do this. But we're looking at mankind beginning to take on a certain role on the planet as a whole. We're looking at mankind taking on a global influence and management of the biosphere as a whole, of the global water system as a whole, which has until now solely been the domain of action of the sun itself. So in a sense, you're looking at mankind taking on the role of force on the planet that the sun has otherwise played. And will probably surpass and overtake the role of the sun at some point in terms of our ability to manage and improve the terrestrial water cycle. But to do that will probably require our own mastery of the principle of the sun here on Earth through the application of fusion power. Now, obviously that's water, that's one example, but that's an expression of what mankind is as a species. The ability to create through human creative action the types of resources needed, and it applies to everything, to food, to materials, to industry, to power, so on. As Executive Intelligence Review has presented in their new full global program, the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge. Mankind now has at its fingertips really the potential to address the needs of the entire world population through infrastructure, technology, science driver programs, but recognizing that when mankind applies itself in these ways, we literally create the resources, create the wealth, create the value, which will not only support a larger population than we even have now, but can support a larger population at a higher living standard than we currently have. You know, mankind does not find wealth, he creates it. Mankind is different than any animal species on this planet. And ultimately, this is really what you could call the scientific basis underlying the scientific validity of President Xi Jinping's policy of this win-win cooperation. You know, we're not talking about charity or sacrificing, although there's nothing wrong with those concepts, but we don't need to have charity or sacrifice to split a finite amount of wealth on this planet. With this type of win-win cooperation, pursuing this unique creative ability of mankind, we can, as a whole, bring mankind to a higher level. We can create the type of revolutionary advance that moves the entire human species to a new stage. And this is what's natural. This is what makes the human species truly human. And I think Mr. LaRouche would want to underscore and emphasize that it goes farther than even what we're talking about so far here. It goes to the moon. It goes to what China is doing on the moon, where you have on the moon, and this is what China is now looking at with some of their leading scientists, you have on the moon this strange dust, this very fine, very abrasive material, frankly somewhat nasty stuff. It wasn't very inviting to the Apollo astronauts that landed on the moon decades ago. But you have this fine abrasive dust covering the entire planet, of the entire surface of the moon. But in this surface layer, in this otherwise worthless and, if anything, annoying dust, you have built up over billions of years a very significant accumulation of this wonderful little isotope, this one type of helium, helium-3. So we're looking at the ability of the prospect of mankind going to the moon, taking this otherwise frustrating dust and potentially using this and turning it into the most powerful energy source, the most highest energy flux density source of power available to mankind today with advanced forms of helium-3 fusion. And will be forced, as Mr. LaRouche has emphasized, since his becoming familiar with China's lunar program and the prospects for this type of mission, we'll be forced to look at mankind completely differently in a process of accomplishing this mission. We'll have to recognize that no longer is mankind a species on this earth alone. That our existence on earth will literally be redefined from the standpoint of our more powerful and higher order existence in the solar system as a whole. Just as Kepler was the one that really first taught us this principle. We may remain, for the most part, physically on Earth, most people most of the time. But even the people living on Earth, their existence will increasingly be redefined by this larger process. Even our existence physically on Earth will be redefined by mankind's changed relationship, not just to the planet, but the whole solar system. And I think ultimately, from the standpoint of where mankind is at today, that is our source of wealth. That is our source of value. And that is the potential right now before us with this concept of the U.S. joining a win-win policy premised on the development of the creative powers of the human species as a unique species different than animals, which is defined by this ability to constantly revolutionize our relationship to the universe.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring a conclusion to our webcast at this point. I would like to thank both Jeffrey Steinberg and Ben Deniston for joining me in the studio tonight, and thank you to all of you who tuned in. If you have not yet, please visit the website where we have the list of all the signers of the BRICS petition. Add your signature and circulate it as widely as you can. And please stay tuned to LaRouchePack.com. Thank you. Good night.